Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and once again it is time for the Monday Q&As. So let's knock this out. First question. Are there any supplements that will help you become a better student by improving memory/cognition significantly? For the most part, no. The only thing that seems to potentially help with that is going to be essential fatty acids of some type, generally EPA and DHA more specifically, so fish oil caps or algae that has EPA and DHA in it. There's a lot of other supplements that are purported to do this, but there's no real data showing that they will, and if anything, they're probably only going to help you if you have some sort of dietary deficiency that's contributing in some way to just lack of cognition. So that's the only ones that I can think of, other than, of course, stimulants and things like caffeine. All right, next question. Any cons to working out in an air-conditioned room? I try to avoid it, but I figured it's better than to not be able to train as intense as you want. I've trained in all sorts of temperatures, different environments, and in all honesty, I find that for me, doing any sort of higher volume, higher rep work, that you become fatigued faster in a really hot room. By really hot room, I'm talking 30 degrees or more Celsius, like what it gets in the unconditioned gyms in some of the places like here down in Houston. And I personally found that I was able to prep for competitions just fine in freezing weather by just bundling up, and I never found that it impeded my performance a lot. So in all honesty, I'm going to say air-conditioned rooms are perfectly fine. There's no reason to think that it's going to hurt your performance in any way. Just remember that extreme temperatures in any direction well beyond your comfort zone could impede your performance and cause more fatigue as you train. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to allow you to make good adaptations, but it will make your training more difficult and tiring. All right, next question. If you are an intermediate or advanced lifter and you did an exercise you never did before, will you make strength and size gains because you are new to that exercise? Yes and no. You will make strength gains very quickly initially as a more advanced lifter who has all the muscle mass already associated with a more advanced lifter, because you'll learn the motor patterns and you'll make the neuromuscular adaptations really quickly on that exercise up to the size that you're carrying. And you'll get stronger on it quickly. As far as gaining muscle mass, no, you'll only gain extra muscle mass from that if you stimulate a new workload and adaptation that your body isn't fully adapted to yet, meaning you put in enough tension on there that you're stimulating new growth, just like you would with any other exercise. It won't be any different. However, it can oftentimes help bring up maybe lagging points because you've changed an angle in some way that changes the emphasis a bit beyond your normal methods, and it might bring up one of the primary movers a bit more that might be lagging, at least for the function of that particular exercise. But as far as new growth beyond the exercises you're probably doing now, not really. But remember, the new strength gains you gain are going to be mostly neuromuscular in nature. All right, next question. While running HST, and for those who don't know that, that's hypertrophy specific training, I'm slow cutting and slash recomping. The only leg work I do is 2 sets of squats, 3 sets of calf raises, and 1 set of deadlifts every other session. Does that seem like enough volume to you? Initially, I was doing 3 sets of squats, no deadlifts, and I went backwards pretty hard. As I've told you guys before, if you're trying to slow cut or recomp, your total work volume has to go down if you want to adapt, unless you're either very genetically gifted in the recovery aspect of everything, or unless you're on drugs that improve recovery, and generally larger amounts of them. You do need to limit volume in that situation. You need to just stimulate the growth and the adaptation that you can and get out and quit. And in this case, if you're only able to handle 2 sets of squats and 1 set of deadlifts every other session, as long as you're getting stronger on those and your performance is improving even slightly during your recomp or your cut, you're probably stimulating new growth and new adaptation. So that's perfectly acceptable. Just remember that when you're not eating in a surplus to gain weight, the odds that you're going to make very fast adaptations are slim to none, and therefore your training volume should reflect that accordingly. Your training volume should be there to make sure that you're able to recover and make any adaptations at all, because if you can make any growth whatsoever when not in a calorie surplus, you should always consider that a win, because you're going to gain muscle tissue without gaining size. And if that means cutting your volume to a half or even a third of what you might normally be able to handle is required for you to do that, then that's simply what you have to do. All right, next question. Standing cable crunch or kneeling cable crunch for hypertrophy in regards to getting physique like Steve Reeves, or would you suggest bodyweight crunch exercises? The thing to remember is that your core work itself is going to do very little for changing your appearance. Your actual abs are pretty much smaller muscles. They don't grow a lot as a result of training. And most of the growth that they do get is going to be from your bigger compound movements. You're just trying to strengthen them a little bit and maybe bring out just a little more hypertrophy in those muscles by doing the crunches. So I also like to look at crunches from the perspective of what else do they help beyond just doing that. Now, any of those choices that you made are actually good for development for your abs. However, if you want something that's going to carry over just slightly more to your other big standing compound movements like deadlift, squats, overhead press, I would lean in the direction of these standing cable crunches or standing band crunches, just because they're going to give you potentially more carryover to those big lifts as far as stability due to specificity of training. But is it going to make that big of a difference at the end of the day? Probably not. All right, next question. Thoughts on whether I should bulk and cut for martial arts competition or recomp weigh-ins in this fed or right before the fight, so no water cuts? And I personally have met the guy who asked this question. He's a really nice guy. I'm going to recommend that you don't do bulks and cuts for any sort of contact sport like that, fighting sports, purely because you don't want to get used to being at a much higher body weight than you actually compete at. So if you bulk up and then you cut 20 or 25 pounds, and then you do a very, very tiny water cut, you're not going to be at your normal fighting weight for a large part of your training months out from the competition. And it's going to potentially affect the way that you're used to moving your body in those different movements. So I'm going to tend to recommend for people who do fighting sports of any type that they just recomposition and try not to fluctuate their body weight more than about 10 pounds at the most. So focus on recomping, and just remember, you can do very, very small water cuts with the day of the competition weigh-ins, but don't try to do something crazy like 9 or 10 pounds. 3, 4, 5 pounds can be done just with dietary manipulation and you'll be okay. And again, I'm going to recommend that you stick to mostly recomping and don't go more than about 10 pounds over your fighting weight anytime you're within 5 to 6 months of a competition. All right, next question. According to Alan Aragon, you should not use too much fish oil. Could you be eating too much fish as well? Yeah, Alan's right. He's got a lot of research backing that. I've seen the actual data that he's produced on that, and Alan's absolutely right on that. Consuming 10 grams or more of 30% fish oil per day, like 30% EPA and DHA, can negatively affect your immune system and compromise immune function. So yeah, in theory, if you're consuming enough fish every day to exceed that same threshold, which is going to put you at about 3 grams of EPA or DHA a day to hit that threshold, if you're consuming enough cold water fish every day to reach that same threshold, you should probably expect the same potential negative effects, the compromised immune system. So yeah, like with anything else, remember that you can't overdo it on things like omega-3s, even from natural sources such as your whole foods. All right, next question. Stiff leg deadlift, flat back versus Romanian deadlift for hamstring development, and the major difference in performing these two. They seem to be really similar. No, they're not. Some people perform stiff leg deadlift flat back without touching the ground, but it still claims not to be a Romanian deadlift. I have tutorial videos on all this stuff. Check out my how-to playlist. A stiff leg deadlift flat back is actually, you're missing some of the benefits of even doing the stiff leg deadlift by doing it flat back. But if you're not touching the ground, you are still doing a bastardized Romanian deadlift, not a stiff leg deadlift. The whole point of the stiff leg deadlift is so that you can stretch all the way to the floor and pull from the floor with your hamstrings. And it's also there so that you can round the back on it and get the fuller range of motion. It's really a better thoracic erector exercise than anything. It's still a great hamstring exercise, but if your goal is purely hamstring hypertrophy and development, I would lean in the direction of the Romanian deadlift because it's performed in a manner that lets you utilize a stretch reflex on the hamstring, also called a myotatic reflex. And in so doing, you can stimulate some motor units and muscle fibers that you might not otherwise reach with these other big movements. And it is generally my preferred exercise for someone who needs to bring up their hamstrings. But the difference is, on the Romanian deadlift, you don't touch the floor. And remember, if you're doing a stiff leg deadlift and you're not touching the floor, you are basically doing a Romanian deadlift because you are lowering the weight to a stretch and then snapping back up with the eccentric storing energy. Whereas if you rest it on the floor, like a standard stiff leg deadlift, that is not replicating the same movement. So remember, if you're not touching the floor, you're still just doing a variation of the Romanian deadlift. It's not a true stiff leg deadlift. So they're quite different in that regard. And that one of them is pulled from a dead stop, It's a concentric based exercise, whereas in the Romanian deadlift means you're lowering down and not going all the way down and then snapping back up with stored energy off the eccentric, which makes it a more eccentric based exercise, not a concentric. So hopefully that clarifies the difference. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time in part 2.